Hi, I'm Anne.
And I'm Paul, and welcome to Out of Plaece, where we speak of the ones who are challenging the status quo, leading from curiosity, doing things differently, and above all, have felt out of place somewhere along the way.
We've got honest stories, real lessons from business and life from people who have been there, are doing it, and those who are just getting started.
You're exactly where you need to be. Let's get into it. So today's episode, we're going to be looking into a bit of your background, Anne. And I guess throughout your life, you've kind of felt between two different worlds. But before we start there, you were the kind of person who was inspired to come up with the podcast name Out of Plaece. So where did that name come from and what kind of inspired you?
So the first one was related to the business and finding something that could string together and make sense of place, the business that we have. But then as I was kind of formulating this idea and the words out of place came into mind, I thought, well, isn't this a really nice way of framing the experiences that we've had, but also the prospects and also clients that we'll have as part of Place as well? Because, the type of industries that we're looking at are people who work in holistic and wellness, and you're in that industry yourself. And typically those people have had to overcome some kind of hardship. They have felt as if they're outsiders or misunderstood throughout their whole lives. And then that's led them to take a path towards healing and transformation of themselves, and then turning that practice into a business and a lifestyle. So I thought Out of Place not only covers our experiences, but it's the experiences of others that we will, bring into this podcast as well. Not just clients, not just prospects, but people we know who we know have experienced being out of place at some point in their lives.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I think sometimes when you do feel out of place, it's a journey that you carry by yourself, carry it alone, and it can become quite lonely. But when you start kind of talking with other people on those topics of why you feel out of place, maybe it's feeling misunderstood, maybe it's feeling imposter syndrome, maybe it's feeling like, you just don't quite fit in. When you start to really open that up and start to express that part of yourself, you suddenly realize that there's a lot of people around you that have also felt out of place.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have the ability to relate with someone who's felt out of place, it really feels supportive and empowering. And maybe this feeling of being out of place, maybe it's actually under the surface, a bit of a superpower. So what do the words out of place actually mean to you?
So for me, being out of place would be a way to describe how I've felt all of my life. I have felt like an outsider. I have felt misunderstood, misinterpreted as well, but also an underdog in a lot of areas of life. So, yeah, Out of Place kind of encompasses all those facets and aspects of my life and my journey through the different places and experiences and environments I've been in.
So how I want to kind of approach this conversation is instead of going through it chronologically, where we would start from, early childhood to now, I want to speak to kind of what comes to the forefront of your mind when we speak about, I guess, feeling between two worlds. So maybe a good topic to talk about first is work. How was that navigation as a woman in the workplace, carrying all that through where you felt misunderstood, unheard, and out of place?
So, let's start at the start of my career. I worked in a lot of very male dominated industries where you didn't see someone like yourself at the top. It was very rare. The type of people that would be there would be middle aged men, and they would have their own style of leadership, I would say. So, you start to learn and model yourself off those people. And that type of leadership for me it was kind of impersonal. It was very masculine in the way that they carried themselves. And so I learned that as my leadership style. And the reason why I did that is because it enabled me to feel as if I was part of that group. And
When you say part of that group, are there any, real life examples where you felt like, okay, I want to fit in, I want to go with this kind of what seemed accepted in the corporate world and even in society? Are there any specific examples of that?
so one of the first companies I worked for was Honda, and that was in the motorcycles, power equipment, marine area of the business. And pretty much all guys. There were very few women in that particular department. And if there were women, they were in kind of, sales coordinator type of roles. And so there wasn't anyone for me to look up to from a female perspective. And in order for me to feel as if I had an opportunity in that organization, I had to play with the guys. I had to act like them. I had to talk like them. I had to move like them. And so we'd go to these, marine expos around the country, and I'd hang out with the guys. We'd go and we'll pack up the stage and we'll get it all going, and then we'll head up for dinner, and then, we'd go for drinks, and I would just follow that crowd because it was my way of feeling as if I could fit in and as if they would accept me as their own.
And did that create any kind of disconnect for you with your actual true identity?
Oh, for sure, because as I was saying, the leadership style that I learnt from initially was this very masculine, dominate the people around you kind of leadership, which I then modeled. So, when I speak to people now, I'm like, oh, I was an I was a manager back in my early days because I learnt to manage people. I learnt to think of them as a metric and as a number, as a resource in an organization. But part of me knew that that's not how you treat people. That's not how you lead. That's not how you bring people along with a vision and to make them feel like they have some kind of agency within the work that they're doing and the organization. But it did take me a while to, slowly transition away from that type of management style because it was successful. It helped me to get the promotion. It helped me to be seen. It helped me to sit in on the tables with the conversations that I need to be in because I guess effectively played the game.
And as you're playing this game, it's pulling you away from maybe your natural instinct for how you would want to lead, for how you would want to manage. So it's creating that, I guess, a little bit of turbulence inside you, maybe?
Yeah, there was definitely this kind of friction. One part of me would be going through the motions of, managing somebody as I had been taught to manage somebody. But then the other part of me thought, well, hold on a sec. This person's going through something. Let's just talk to them as a human and understand where they're coming from instead of assuming or instead of going, well, this is your work persona, this is your personal persona. You can't have those two things mixing. And so, you leave that at home, but only bring this one forward.
So keeping with the work environment, where was next?
Next was Volvo. So keeping in the manufacturing automotive side, environments that I understood. It was somewhere that I could continue playing the game. I could behave in the way that people wanted me to, and that would ensure my success. And it wasn't until I was into BP, I think that was the next part of my career, where went, this really doesn't feel right. The way that I am showing up at work, the way that I am, as I was moving into more kind of cross-functional leadership type of roles, it just wasn't making sense to me. And I would have this friction inside going, that's just not the way you should be treating people or the way that you really, at the core of it, want to lead people either.
Something you just mentioned was success. So the definition of success at that time, again, was trending in a direction of what we'd been taught success meant, what we believed success to be. When did you start to really have a different maybe opinion or version on success and what it meant versus the kind of leadership style that you'd adopted?
That required me to question my general societal beliefs initially. Was the life that I was living my own? And was I making choices for myself? Or was I making choices because this was the path that you take? You find you go to uni, you find someone, you find the job, you buy the house, you do the things. And when I started to question that, that's when I started to question, well, if I can question that in my own life, then I can question it in business. But business becomes a little bit harder because you don't control the variables there. And especially as a woman who is navigating her career, where there will be a question at some stage, not that people will actually say it to you explicitly, maybe in some places they do, but there'll be that question mark of, oh, is she going to go off and have children? And so then you think, well, how do I navigate that? How do I ensure that they know that that's not part of my path and my choice? And so you have to start to kind of being explicit about certain things in order to ensure that you have an opportunity. And I think that's the thing that people forget. And especially when we roll around to like March, when it's International Women's Day, and you get people questioning, whether or not we need to have it. People assume that equality is equity when it's not. Equality is assuming that people have 50-50, an equal share of things. And equality is probably doesn't do service enough to women, especially in the workplace. Whereas equity knows that people don't have fair opportunity and also their starting places are different as well. And I think that's a really important distinction for people to learn and understand because that does put women at a disadvantage.
And what's it like to experience that? Like, can you walk us through, for you, how was what was it like to experience that in the workplace, in society?
Let's play a quick example out. In the workplace, in your career, how many times have you been sexually harassed?
Never.
In my case, definitely 3. And so that's the lived experience of a woman in the workplace, is that not only are you trying to vie for your position and your opportunity, but you have to deal with the fact that there are people who are going to treat you in a way that is, not conducive to any kind of work. It's just the way that they're going to behave towards you. And so that's one area that I don't think men understand in the workplace, that happens to a lot of women. When we look at the stats in terms of, female CEOs in Australia, it's like 1 in 5. So then you don't have the people who you can aspire to because they don't look like you, they don't come across like you. And then also the other thing in workplaces for women as well is when you come across as assertive, it comes across as bitchy. And that's the terminology people will use instead of going, she's just making a point.
Because you've been sat in predominantly male orientated boardrooms, right?
Mhm.
How have you found that experience, that communication, and when you have shared your opinion or where you have shared a belief or where you're just presenting, how have you often felt it's been received in that space?
I felt that I've had to work harder to get my message across. I felt that at times I was not completely dismissed, but there have been times where I've had to just reiterate the message again and again to get my point across. Um, the age has also been, I think, a factor as well. So, a lot of the boardrooms I've sat in, I have been one of the youngest or the youngest person in the room. So not only am I the youngest, I'm also female. And people who have, maybe a decade or 2 above me in terms of experience will look at me and go, what is she doing here? Has she really earned her place here? And that comes back down to, what people may traditionally feel is earning your place is, working through the ladder, you know, making up the years as well. So putting in that work over decades, then you earn the right. Instead of thinking about work and thinking about people's experiences, but also their ability to bring outcomes to the business.
So in that kind of environment, in that kind of executive leadership space, it sounds like it was really a fight to establish yourself and establish yourself where your opinions and what you were sharing from a strategic lens were really being heard and considered and not just going over people's heads who were sat in that boardroom.
Yeah, and also I think this is an experience that quite a few women have, where you will say something and then a male counterpart will say pretty much the same thing, but maybe they have more conviction in how they say it, or maybe they've framed it in the right way, and it then gets heard at that point.
Or maybe just subconsciously, men are more likely to hear that when another man speaks it.
That is a really good point.
So we've talked about the kind of leadership realm of your career, but obviously in a leadership role, you have a team who's working with you. How did you find that the people who worked around you and with you? How do you find that they took your leadership and took your style? Did you feel like you had to bend or shift or shape shift to kind of fit in and communicate with them in a way where you'd feel like you deserve to be there, or something different?
No, it's really funny that the people who work for you in your team don't really behave in that kind of way. They accept you as their leader or manager, and they accept that you are there for a reason. And I guess you prove that through your daily actions with them as well, and how you treat them as people. And as I said, my early leadership style wasn't the best. I was an arsehole, let's be honest. But then as I progressed and I learnt to become truer to my own leadership style, then it became a lot easier to bring people along on that journey. One thing that I wanted to make sure that everyone in my team had was an understanding of their own agency, autonomy with what they did in their role, the freedom to be creative as well. I think that's really important in the workplace. Permission to play and be creative. I think, if I had to define it in that way. So in my team, um, understood that I was there and I would back them and I would support them and I would give them the space to grow into their roles and opportunity as well. And where I saw space for me to, do things a little bit differently to bring people through than I did. Like in one example, I find that there's a lot of international students who obviously are studying in Australia. They find it really difficult to find placements. And this organization reached out to me and said, hey, would you be open to do like an intern program? And when I looked at the program, from a financial perspective, it worked for the company, first of all. So I made sure that, that side was ticked off. But then on the other side, for me, it was like, I can give an opportunity to these, first generation Australians to apply themselves here and to work, but not to be judged. Because I feel that there are still people who will go, oh, but, are their language skills good enough? Are they Australian enough to be in this company? Do they understand how our culture works? Rather than actually just going, here's the opportunity, you go show me that you can do it.
So you I guess had been in marginalized positions yourself. So when you were supporting people who were also, I guess, classed in that same bucket, you really found a way to, I guess, understand that it may be challenging for them. Where they're starting off from to get that next opportunity is going to be a much bigger gap than maybe, say, for the likes of me, when I came out of university and so on. Something you mentioned was you kind of found alignment with your truth of your leadership style. When you found that, how did the landscape in work feel then? How did the landscape in the boardrooms feel? What changes did it make within you? So what was that shift like for you?
Yeah, I'll kind of take it back a little bit to how that shift came about. So I moved from more traditional type of organizations into tech. And that was a really conscious choice. I actually, went through a recruiter to try to find this opportunity because I'd been seeing the news about, Facebooks and Googles and how they were changing the way that offices and teams and organizations worked. And I really liked that. I thought, like, that's exciting, that's different, that's new, and that feels like it would be a better space for me. And so when I found myself at one organization, um, the leadership was different. People were actually leading from their heart and they cared about the people in the organization. But also, I started to see more females in leadership roles in that organization as soon as they came in. And not only were they, leading large teams, they were making, changes within the organization, they were being listened to and heard, but they were also leading with authenticity. They were just being themselves. They weren't trying to, fit into the mold. They weren't trying to play the corporate game. They were just like, this is who I am. This is how I am. This is how I lead. And you accept it or you don't. And it was accepted. And so when I saw that, when it was, shown to me and presented to me that that is possible, that's when I was like, okay, I can do that too. There's an opportunity for me to do this. And so that was kind of like that first shift into it. As I progressed into roles where I could lead a team, that's when I was like, okay, now I can start to maybe influence. Maybe I can start to make changes to how we lead people. Maybe about how we, think more about the human behind the role or the name and how we show up to work. And then actually the other thing that really helped me shift that was COVID, because COVID gave us as leaders an entry point into people's homes. We could sit there on screen and I can see, the dog running behind somebody, someone's child running behind them naked, screaming and whatever it was, or, their mum knocking at the door, bringing them a cup of tea. So I then became exposed to that there's more to these people that I'm working with every single day in their daily lives that will interrupt their flow, that will distract them, that will take them away from doing the work. But I can now actually understand that and see it and respect it and, enable them to have the space to be able to bring their full selves to work and not have to be hidden behind this persona.
Yeah, you're starting to see a human, not just who they're showing up to work to be and to tick the boxes and stuff. You're starting to see a human, right? And I think there's a shift in society, especially post-COVID, and now with, artificial intelligence coming along, that emotional intelligence is going to be such a huge part of how we build companies and build sustainable companies moving forwards, because the world really demands something more of us now. And I personally believe it's a beautiful shift that we're starting to celebrate and recognize humans for humans. And for you as a woman, how is your experience of that? How is your experience of, okay, now where people are allowed to, it's more accepted that people are bringing them full selves into these spaces?
I think in a lot of the organizations I worked with from that point on, acceptance of the way that I led, and there was the space for me to do that and experiment and test as well. But then there were also moments where people had been leading in a particular way, where they would see the way that I would operate with my team or engage with them. I'd have drinks with them on a Friday, or I would do like a introduction to the team in a different way to what is used, right? What people are used to. It wasn't your normal icebreakers. It wasn't your normal way of going, okay, this is how we introduce a new person to the team. It was playful. It was, bringing some sense of joy to the workplace. And I feel that some people saw that as maybe being too soft or too feminine in the way that I approached it. But the results proved themselves. My team, when we looked at, the employment scores and the happiness scores of the team, they were the happiest of anybody in the organization, because not only was I creating a space where they felt comfortable to be themselves, but also gave them the opportunity to learn and grow into those roles. But also the other part was I didn't try to control how they experienced work. I
You,
wanted them to have freedom.
I guess you mentioned before about we create these mask personas of how we show up to work. A lot of that is systemic. It goes very, very deep. It's impacted women, it's impacted marginalized people for a long, long time. But when you can create more of a nurturing, emotional environment and allow people to feel safe, you mentioned the word freedom, allow them to bring freedom into their role. Not only is company performance going to improve, is employee well-being going to improve, people are going to struggle from less and less mental health challenges, because work has to be a big contributor to the mental health of our society and who we're expected to be.
I feel that traditionally, and the old way of thinking is that it's almost like Severance, the TV show. There is this expectation that you have your outie, which is your just, who you are day to day. And then there's your innie. And as soon as you cross the threshold of the office door, the elevator, you switch into this persona and you detach from the outside person completely. And that's an old way of thinking about work, especially now when we have these remote or hybrid environments where you have no space between your work and your home and your family and everything else around you. It all kind of blends and there's this gray area. So why don't we accept people for who they are in their entirety rather than assuming and expecting them to have this work persona that turns up?
It's enabling and empowering people not to hide parts of themselves, because every single person has something to bring to the table, so to speak, right? And giving people the freedom and the creative opportunity to bring that is surely just something that supports not just a workplace, but supports us as a society in moving forwards in the future.
Yeah, but I back to one of your early questions. I do find, and I did find, when I wanted to make these changes, these shifts in how I managed and led my team and operated, it made certain people feel uncomfortable because it was changing the narrative in terms of how you can enable your team to grow and to prosper and thrive from what they were used to, because they have these generational beliefs maybe that, this is how you lead a team, this is how you operate a team. It's through control, that they can't have any agency of their own, that they have to listen to you, and that's the only way forward. And when you're challenging internally somebody's position, somebody's place, somebody's comfort of how they lead, then yeah, they're going to be uncomfortable and they will probably, not fight back, but they will um, dismiss you for doing that. They will try to get away from those conversations where you're trying to make it more of a broad, accepted thing across the company culture.
You're almost forcing someone into a position where they need to reflect on why they hold certain beliefs. And that in itself is a triggering moment, right? When you are kind of something's thrown in your face and you either reflect on it, or often we get defensive and we can become aggressive with it because we're not maybe ready to visit that part of ourselves that holds that belief.
Or it's questioning our power,
Hmm.
especially in leadership, right? In those executive positions, people move up in those roles because of ego. And if your ego is being questioned, and if your, role or title is being questioned in some kind of way, or it's challenging how you got there, then you're going to be really uncomfortable and you don't want to have to face that.
Something I've experienced through being exposed to, different leadership. When you mentioned the word ego, like often I've been left feeling like there's an insecure ego. It's the insecure ego that needs validating. Someone who's already validated that kind of ego aspect of themselves leads from a completely different way, right? They understand that leadership isn't actually always from the front. Sometimes it's from behind. Sometimes it's the energy and it's the chemistry you build within a unit from behind, where
Mm.
everyone there feels like a leader.
Yeah, it's the momentum that you can actually create and that wave of change in people rather than pulling them with you.
Okay, so we've spoken a lot about your work career. Obviously now that part of your journey has come to an end as you've stepped into, being the chief growth officer of Place, and obviously now with this podcast. But before work, Anne, there was school, Anne. What was that experience like? The schooling system, the access that you had to school.
Yeah, that was definitely a place where I felt very much out of place. School for me was a difficult experience and a challenging environment because though the first part of it is, as I was growing up, my parents were refugees, they were boat people from Vietnam. And so they were adjusting and assimilating to a country that was foreign to them, an environment that was foreign. And they were navigating their way through. And then for us as children, I was born here. My two older siblings were born over in Vietnam. They were adjusting too. So there was this at home, we would have, we would speak Vietnamese, we would speak a little bit of English. And then in school, I would, turn up at school and, be speaking English with people. And so even just that language switch, that context switching was quite interesting. And I didn't really think about how challenging that was as a child. But as a 5-year-old, you're doing that, right? You kind of go into school, you switch into English, you come back home, you switch into Vietnamese. So that was quite challenging. But then also the way that I looked made it really difficult because where I grew up, which is about an hour outside of Melbourne, there weren't really that many Asian families there. And so we were one of few. And so when you're looking different to the other kids, then you get bullied. So my first experience of being bullied was at school and at a very, very young age, pretty much from prep was when it started. It was kids being mean, not thinking that it has an impact on you, but it does. And so I felt so out of place. I felt like, how do I fit into this? How do I actually make this work? I think that's when I started to really disconnect from my Vietnamese side because I felt I had to be more Australian. I felt I had to be more like the other kids to fit in, to make friends, to be, liked as well. And so that's when I started to really take a step away from what I had at home and I almost did have this persona at school, this other person that would turn up. But the bullying, it made me feel like I had to work harder as well. But then I had to, find a way to compete in some kind of way. And so for me, competing, I wasn't athletic. I'm not like you or your family. So for me, competing was through intellectual competing. It was being smarter than other people. It was being able to show them that there was something about me that was special, but it wasn't anything that you could see.
I think, what might often be misunderstood also in your, you know, environment growing up. You mentioned about how your parents moved over to Melbourne as boat people, right? So they're adjusting in this whole new environment, but also there was a war over in Vietnam, right? Which creates a lot of challenges. It creates a lot of fear. So what was your parents, kind of influence or guidance with you around schooling system, bearing in mind that they might have one set of beliefs, but your experience as a child is already feeling like you are not being accepted and you're feeling out of place?
Unfortunately, like with the situation that we were in, my parents had to work really hard. So when they first arrived here in Australia, they effectively worked in Australian sweatshops, sewing, sewing clothes, like brand name clothing. They would be up all night, all morning, all day sewing. And that was how they were making a living, because it was a way in which they could work without having to understand the language, right? You could just keep going. And then my parents decided to start a farm, so a market garden selling Chinese broccoli and coriander and Asian vegetables, because it was a way for them to obviously make a living, to maybe provide for us opportunity as children. And I think the thing that my parents really wanted to do, because of the trauma that they experienced from the war, the lack of safety, the lack of trust of their own government, the volatility of where they lived, then when they came over to Australia, all they wanted to do was to make sure that we had security, we had safety, we had opportunity. And so that was their focus. And because their focus was doing that, and at the time, money was the way in which you can find opportunity and create it.
Freedom.
And freedom. And so they were so focused on that we were kind of left to our own devices in the schooling system. Our parents would turn up for parent-teacher interview. They would get the report card. There were times that they didn't even understand what was on the report card, what was being said to them. Because they worked so hard, we weren't able to afford the opportunity to do extracurricular activities. We didn't play any sports. We didn't go out with friends. The farm that we were on was quite isolated from where my childhood friends were from school. And so a lot of the times we would, as my siblings and I, we just spend time by ourselves. And we wouldn't have the opportunity to go out to other people's homes. There are other reasons that I've learned as I've gotten older as to why my parents were so protective of us and protective of me, because I was exposed to things I probably shouldn't have been as a child. But they, that being on that farm, being in an isolated space was the way to protect us and really ensure our safety because of the fears that they had. And then, other kids would go to other children's, homes for sleepovers and that kind of thing. I didn't do that. I wasn't allowed to do that. I think I went to a friend's house like when I was probably 14, 15, but I had to be picked up. I couldn't stay over. So my experience in childhood and in through school was very different to my peers. But it wasn't something I could express at the time because I was quite an introvert and awkward child as well. And so I couldn't, find the words to talk to people about it. And I didn't want to share it either. I felt kind of like, I did feel like shame because I was so different. And so, yeah, I didn't speak to anybody about it. And I think the experiences my peers had, school holidays, for example, everyone would come back from school holidays. Oh, what did you do? What did you do? I wasn't going to tell people that I worked on the farm. That's all I did, day in, day out.
You're still fighting that against a system that wasn't really built to help you, I guess, incorporate yourself into the way of life over here especially in the Western world, right?
Yeah. So I think the thing people often don't understand is, so when somebody comes over to a country as a refugee, there will be language barriers. There's also cultural barriers. There's lack of community. And as we know, as we're talking now, right, we know that community is really important for people. But if you don't have that safety net, and if you don't have someone who is living the experience that you're living, it makes it really difficult. And so when my parents arrived here, they were processed through like a detention centre. And then they were put into a community of people who had been through the experience before them. And so that's where they started to find some safety and people who understood their experience. But then the rest of the tools you're given are very much Australian tools and English first tools. So you have to start to learn the language really quickly. So you've got the trauma of coming from a war-torn country, you're trying to assimilate in a country that hasn't given you the tools to assimilate properly. You're feeling disconnected from your community because you don't have them. And then you're trying to find your place in this community of people who have all carrying that trauma or carrying that weight and complexity. And you all just try to help each other out as best as you can. And that was the environment that I grew up in. Is I guess the blessing of it is I saw what community looks like when people pull together. I also saw the determination of my parents, like the absolute grit they had to fight for everything. I understood what would take in terms of strength and resilience to be able to overcome challenges from a young age. And I saw what it could do to people when you have deep, deep unresolved trauma.
Yeah. Which is something we don't acknowledge enough as a society and don't offer enough space or support and guidance into helping people working through that. There's certainly a lot of systems and there's obviously access to professional help, but that in itself has barriers, right? As children, with your parents, that wasn't accessible for you to go and see a psychologist, right?
No, not at all. I don't think my parents would have known what psychology was. It just wasn't something that was part of our culture. And so for them, they were navigating not just a difference in culture, but systems and processes, but also, trying to raise these children in a place that was foreign to them.
Yeah. And it sounds like, from a place of survival as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. My parents were surviving every day.
Yeah.
Every day was a fight for them. And then, put on top of it, the rebellious side of me comes out. And I became a brat. I had my brat era with my parents because I felt that, being on the farm was so isolating. And I felt that my parents' protectiveness was really suffocating. Now I know why they were doing it. Now I know the reasoning behind it. But back then, it was a very difficult experience, my childhood.
And you'd mentioned throughout your childhood how you were very introverted.
Hmm.
As you, I guess, were developing and going through the schooling system, and you'd reached that point where you were starting to build friendships. And did you notice at that point that shift from being incredibly introverted, incredibly, maybe like, I'm not too sure what to put out there because I've never felt accepted before? What was it like when you transitioned to the point of, okay, there's people around me, maybe it was at uni or maybe later on in your school life, where you finally felt in a position where you could start putting yourself out there?
Yeah, I would say that started off probably at uni, where I felt that I had some form of agency. I was an adult now, so I could do what I wanted to do, and I can be exposed to different perspectives as well. Because, uni definitely exposes you to different people, different backgrounds, perspectives, lifestyles, choices. And that really was a kind of starting point for me to understand that there was more outside of the farm that I grew up on. There was more outside of the school that I was part of. There was more outside of the community, the Vietnamese community that I, tried to actually disengage from because I didn't want to be Vietnamese. Because I thought that was a barrier for me.
Like it wasn't accepted?
Yeah, it wasn't accepted because that was the starting point of the bullying.
Yeah. So when you are trying to integrate into society, into what's around you, which is very different from what your upbringing was, what was that like? What was it like building friendships?
I think initially for me, it was I felt attracted to people who were like me, people who seemed a little bit out of place, who a little bit of outsiders, weren't quite, definitely weren't the popular ones or the people that others gravitate towards. I liked people who were quiet, who also knew themselves as well. I was attracted to that because I think it was the thing that I didn't see myself. And so those were the people that I wanted to be around. But then over time, as I started to understand what friendships were like and how you build friendships, then that, continued to evolve and grow over time. And then, now in my adulthood, I get to choose my friendships and I get to be very purposeful about how I spend my time with people. But I also understand that, building a relationship with somebody, especially in a friendship, does require a level of vulnerability and intimacy and honesty. And that's what I love about the friendships I have today is that I can just be my full self.
How would you define your friendships today beyond just being your full self? Like, what in your past, up until this point, has helped you really create your beliefs around friendships?
Being honest with yourself, I think, is an important one. So knowing who you are, understanding that, like, myself, I will continue to grow and evolve almost like repeatedly, right? Like I just don't stop. That's a continuous thing for me. And that the friends that I have around me understand that. They understand that I'll continue to evolve and they'll accept me as who I was and who I am and who I'm becoming. And that's really important for me. And there's also for me to ensure that I offer that back to my friends. That no matter where they are in life or no matter what season they're in, that I will be there and I'll support them and I'll love them. And maybe at times we will be a little bit disconnected. Maybe at times we won't be on the same path. We'll kind of, divert off a little bit. But then at some point we'll come back together. And if we don't, we don't as well. So it's just becoming comfortable and understanding that friendships will move and grow and merge and change and shift or disappear.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful because the journey of each person is it's so unique, but it requires compassion, understanding, and to know to never make it about you when it comes to supporting friendships. And thank you for being just so open with your journey and what you've experienced in life. And I can just see that real kind of passion and love you have for people who have more barriers when trying to access something, who do feel marginalized. So I guess before we wrap up this episode, love to ask you a bit of a personal question. You have a vision for Out of Place, the podcast. You have your vision that's brought into place. But what really is Anne's vision in this life?
If I could help people feel less alone, and especially first, second generation Australians, because I have an understanding of their experiences, I have an understanding of the barriers that they have to face, and particularly women as well. If I could help shift the way that they are perceived and open up the door for more people to have opportunity and understand that, equality and equity are not the same thing, then that would be amazing. Like I really think that, we sometimes assume, and people assume this about me, right? They assume where I am today that I may have come from privilege. And I've had people say that before. They're like, oh, I didn't realize your background. I didn't realize the hardship you came from. And it's just because of how I present today, I guess. But, people need to look behind how people present and actually understand the people as they are, as humans, and not assume that everybody's given the same fair opportunity in life.
Beautiful. And just one last thing.
Okay.
What would 10-year-old Anne be thinking right now?
Oh, if 10-year-old Anne could swear, she would probably be like, what the fuck is going on? Like, why would you expose yourself like this? Why would you be putting yourself in front of a camera, in front of a microphone? She'd be going, what happened to you? But I think also 10-year-old Anne would be going, wow, like Is that who we become? What a change.
Thank you for your courage and your strength to kind of sit in the multiple different experiences you've had throughout life, the multiple barriers you've had to face, whether it was from being a child to going through the schooling system to the workplace. And it's just, as a partner, not just a podcast host, it's very, very inspiring just to witness it.
Oh, here come the tears. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for listening to Out of Place. If something in today's episode resonated with you, let us know or share it with someone who might need it too.
As we wrap up this episode, and having spoken about identity and in some ways agency and sovereignty, we would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of land we're recording on today. And we pay our respects to the elders past, present and future, and extend the respect to all First Nations people listening.
Thanks for listening to Out of Place. If something in today's episode resonated with you, let us know or share it with someone who might need it too. Or leave us a review, it helps more than you know. We're so grateful to be building this episode alongside you.
To learn more or to connect with us, hop onto Instagram and look up Out of Place, spelt Plaece.
Here's to finding your way, even when it feels a little out of place. We'll see you in the next episode.